Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody from all around the world. It's great to have you here with us. Um, in today's presentation, Shaler and I invite you to imagine what it is like to live with a chronic illness or to live beyond a life-altering diagnosis or an injury. We're speaking of diagnosis so serious that it reshapes your desires and possibilities and affects how you move through the world every day. So we're speaking of a close to the bone change that you cannot ignore or fix, what we might call a soul wound. With a slight shift in imagination, we encourage you to consider any serious confrontation with your being in the world as an existential threshold. Crossing the threshold is a point of no return to your previous identity, your role, your previous authority, responsibility, and sense of self. It also may mean living among your family and friends as a stranger, an outsider, because emerging from the underworld of serious illness or injury disrupts relationships in obvious ways and in some very subtle ways. Your illness or injury is not merely yours, an individual experience. Instead, it shakes up your community. In fact, some of you may not have personally experienced such a diagnosis or an injury, but you're here because you know somebody who has. We're speaking to you too. Those of you who are witnesses or caregivers, part of the community who may wonder, how will their diagnosis change my life? So we're speaking to the people who have suffered this kind of injury or illness, something that is an existential threshold, something that alters your life in profound ways, and those of you who have been on the near outside of that experience, I should say, somebody who is a caregiver and whose own lived experience has profoundly changed as a result of the diagnosis or the illness or injury of the person that you love. So we're inviting you to think back on the moment of discovery, the moment of the diagnosis or the injury, as crossing a threshold into a new life that has barely begun. That new life is a mystery. It's a mystery to begin with, since the shock of an unexpected diagnosis or injury is disorienting, and the new you and the new life can only be discovered along the way. But what is a threshold? I'm going to be a very good Jungian here and look closely at that word threshold using the Oxford English Dictionary. And it's there we find two meanings for the word threshold. The first is a threshold is a strip of wood, metal, or stone forming the bottom of a doorway and crossed in entering a house or a room. That's a material threshold. Another definition of threshold, though, is that's equally applicable to this experience is it refers to the magnitude or intensity that must be exceeded for a certain reaction, phenomenon, result, or condition to occur or to be manifested. So both definitions, you'll probably notice, refer to material thresholds, something that we can see or touch or measure, crossing a doorway into a room, or noticing a change in the temperature of a room, for instance. In fact, that's a good way of thinking about threshold for just a moment, is setting the temperature for heating or cooling your home. But magnitude or intensity, this second definition of threshold, also refers to what we might call an inner temperature or an inner change in the weather, an inner subjective felt sense of a change in the atmosphere of your life. Again, whether you are the person who has heard the diagnosis or suffered the injury, or whether you are living with that person or living close to that person, there's an atmospheric shift. And that's what we mean by threshold. It's an unmeasurable yet meaningful change in And it can affect us in so many ways. It certainly can affect us emotionally. It can affect us mentally, changing how we think. It can affect us in terms of our daily habits and practices. And it can affect us spiritually. So not only is it very real to the person who crosses that threshold, who has the illness or the injury that is life altering, but it is very real, even if it's unmeasurable, if you will, to the people around that person. So let me get a little bit more specific. Life altering serious illness or injury can be diagnosed. After careful observations and tests of wellness, doctors did diagnose it. It was and is measurable in a medical sense. In fact, you or the person you're thinking about probably remember the day when you heard that diagnosis vividly. But hearing that diagnosis is really different from registering the diagnosis, registering it emotionally and mentally, the inner felt sense of the change. That's the threshold we're speaking about, that inner felt sense, that embodied subjective knowledge that the illness has altered my life or a life irrevocably. Just speaking personally for me, I'll understand that moment at one level, but it sometimes takes me hours or days to deepen into the somatic felt sense of that change. I'm just maybe a little slow on the uptake here. So what I'd like to do is have you look at and listen to 6 different questions and choose one of them to write down. I'll show those questions for you in just a moment. The first 3 questions assume that you are the one living with life-altering illness or injury. The last 3 questions prompt reflection upon someone else's experience rather than your own, as we shall see when we get to the myth describing Demeter and Persephone from the Homeric hymns. A family member's illness or injury, for instance, easily may have changed your life. So whether you are the one needing care or the caregiver, there is a transformative psychological moment, a threshold moment. So let me go ahead and share screen. And here, here are the questions. The first question: when did you cross the psychological threshold of illness or injury and ponder how it would shape your daily routine? When did you realize that the illness or injury is a new way of being that affects what you eat, when and how you sleep, how much you can exercise, the kinds of work you can do, and the kinds of play? When did you realize that living with the illness or injury shapes your social circle, meaning the people who can understand and empathize and those who cannot? For caregivers, when did you start noticing small changes in habits, activities, or mood of your loved one? For caregivers, how many small changes did you feel in your loved one before knowing the changes were here to stay? And the last question, for caregivers, when did you realize that their transformation might permanently alter your own life and what happened for you? So we're inviting you to choose one of these questions to think about, and then we'll take this up in the discussion in the Q&A after the presentation is finished. And you can also keep these 6 questions for yourself for the future, if you have time to reflect and that these turn out to be useful questions. So go ahead and take a moment to choose one, jot it down, and then I'll continue. All right. So we now want to deepen our imagination of illness or injury as a threshold experience by drawing upon ancient stories. No, these ancient stories do not speak about the kinds of medical diagnoses common today. You don't even find them anywhere mentioned in the DSM, for instance, but they do speak about transformative illness or suffering. And we're asserting that living beyond a life-altering illness or injury can be more than physically and socially transformative. It can also become a path of soul or spirit. And I want to mention just now that the very first research project that I engaged in 30 years ago was on this very topic. It was on life-altering illness, and it was in the process of interviewing women, 6 women who had undergone a life-altering illness or diagnosis, that I discovered the resonance with the myth that I'm going to be talking more deeply about today, which is, as I mentioned before, the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It was quite an astonishing piece of research with some unexpected results that I truly enjoyed, and it was my introduction into depth psychology. In fact, it occurred before I even knew what depth psychology was, or as I was beginning to learn what depth psychology was. So it was a long time ago. So viewing illness or injury as a path of soul or spirit requires a certain orientation to the events of our lives, an orientation that Jung referred to as symbolic. I think of this orientation as freedom from literalism, which prompts us to engage in a process of wonder, as in, I wonder what, or I wonder whether. It's an attitude of curiosity that engages the imagination and fuels the ability to transform an event into an experience. I borrow that phrase, transform an event into an experience, of course, from James Hillman, which is how he defines psychologizing in his landmark text, Revisioning Psychology. So psychology is psychologizing, seeing through. It requires this kind of wonder, this kind of curiosity, this momentary or more than momentary pause to reflect and think symbolically about this diagnosis or illness. Another way that I think about it is that it's a move out of suffering and into story. All great stories revolve around a crisis. Illness can be a meaningful crisis by forcibly ejecting us from so-called normal life. We cross a threshold and there is no going back. But what exactly is normal life? I think that's a really good question today in 2023. At this moment in history, normal is ego-centered, achievement-oriented, and fast. In fact, getting along in 21st century life means acceleration to an unhealthy tempo and little time for thoughtful reflection or the simple contentment of stillness. It also means for most of us, ignoring the inconvenient truth that we are flesh and blood, bone and sinew, and that our embodied lives, how we move through the world, what we desire, what we avoid, what we can do, what we can't, is a potent psychological fact. As James Hillman said about American culture more than 4 decades ago, a society that does not allow its individuals to go down cannot find its depths and must remain permanently inflated in a manic mood disorder disguised as growth. Yet through depression, and I would add illness and injury, we enter depths, and in depths we find soul. We've all seen the devastating outcome of the manic mood disorder disguised as growth, the climate crisis. Things are falling apart all around us. Yet, as Hillman says, only when things fall apart do they open up into new meanings. So let's turn to the old stories of falling apart and new meanings. I'll mention just 3 ancient figures from 3 cultural traditions right now, then I'm going to dive more deeply into another story. So the first figure that I want to mention is Odin from the Norse tradition, who sacrificed an eye to the well of wisdom, Mimir. Later, he hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, seeking wisdom. If we move south, we can notice Inanna from the Sumerian tradition, who descended into the great below. She could only make the journey through a process of stripping every symbol of her power so that she faced her dread sister Ereshkigal naked and bowed low. So yes, for Inanna, it was a choice to go into the underworld, but she was still naive about what that journey was going to do to her. A third individual I want to mention from the Greek tradition, of course, is Chiron, the wounded healer, who symbolizes the possibility of transforming serious illness into a spiritual path and a spiritual gift. I've been recently reading an older book that I highly recommend to all of you if you're interested in Jungian analysis. It's a book about Jungian analysts, their visions and vulnerabilities, and many of them refer to the archetype of the wounded healer and speak about it quite eloquently. It's a book edited by Marvin Spiegelman. If any of you is interested, I can put the information in the chat a little bit later on. So what I want to say about Odin and Inanna and Chiron is that each of them suffered. Their stories also suggest that illness can be transformative for you, your circle of friends and family, and for the larger communities you influence. Again, it's not just an individual journey, and the benefits are not only individual. So now I turn to another story of threshold crossing. It's one of the Homeric hymns, a collection of Greek songs or poems describing events in the lives of the gods. Although there are many fascinating mythologies from all parts of the world, I find myself returning to the Greek stories again and again for one simple reason. The Greek gods are so very human in their emotional lives. They love and they fight like we do. They're competitive, envying, foolish, mean, and tricky. They are also devoted, loving, tender, and passionate. I can relate. I think most of us can relate to all of that. So the story I'm going to tell you, the Homeric hymn to Demeter, is familiar to many Jungian and archetypal psychologists. It describes a powerful mother and her nameless daughter. But there are 2 details of the story that Jungians frequently neglect or misconstrue. And these 2 details are crucial to reflecting upon the underworld of illness or injury. As you hear this abbreviated version, I invite you to imagine the sudden end of the daughter's naivete, her profound disorientation, and the beginning of a new life with a new role and a name of her own, not the part of the story that usually gets a lot of attention. I want you to imagine the ways in which abrupt, unexpected, irreversible change affects an entire family. And because this is a story of gods, the entire world. As with all threshold crossings, the traveler, that is the nameless young maiden, loses her innocence, but the gains are immense. So you are welcome to just close your eyes right now and listen if that's what you prefer to do. One day, a maiden is outside playing with her companions in a beautiful flower-filled meadow. She wanders a little bit apart from her friends because one flower, the narcissus with 100 blossoms, captivates her. As she reaches out to take the narcissus, the earth gapes open to reveal Hades, god of the underworld, who catches the maiden and takes her down into his realm. The maiden screams for her father, but he does not hear her. No one among the gods or men hear her save Hecate, always tender-hearted, and Helios. The maiden grieves and waits. Hope for rescue charms her great heart. Demeter, having lost her daughter, searches the wide world. No one tells Demeter the truth, and she continues her search. Finally, Hecate speaks to Demeter and then Helios. There is no other god to blame but Zeus, he says. Zeus gave your daughter to Hades, his own brother, to be called his fair wife. Demeter grows more enraged and withdraws from the world of gods and men. In her absence, the earth withers and the altars of the gods are left empty of offering. Finally, Zeus bows to the rage of Demeter and returns the child to her mother. Mother and daughter greet each other with great joy and tenderness, but Demeter's joy is tinged with sorrow. While in the underworld, the daughter has eaten the seeds of the pomegranate, a gift from her husband Hades. Did she eat the seeds voluntarily, even greedily? Or did Hades force her to eat the seeds? We do not know. The story does not tell us. Regardless of which is true, Persephone, having eaten, must return to the underworld each year for a period of 4 months. During this season, Demeter still mourns and the earth still withers with her grief. So it's the abduction of the nameless maiden that sets this story in motion. But thereafter, the myth, the Homeric hymn, highlights Demeter's frantic search. It's called the Homeric hymn to Demeter for a reason. We know almost nothing of the maiden's experience. So I wonder if all such journeys into the underworld are essentially individual and mysterious. The experience of profound transformation, like living with life-altering illness or injury, can be shared only in essentials. Yet the question remains, are we willing to integrate transformation into our ordinary daily reality? Even when we want to speak about illness and we use all of our skills to do so, the experience preserves its enigmatic nature. There's something that slips away from us in the telling, even as we make every effort at eloquence. I imagine that this is a way of alerting us to the bottomless depth of such journeys, in that finally arriving is simply not possible. There is no destination. There is no absolute and complete understanding. There's only an endless cascade of deeper understandings. For the maiden, her abduction is the most intimate possible experience. In one shocking moment, everything she has known of her ordinary world changes. Over the course of her mysterious sojourn in the underworld, she is literally wedded to Hades and figuratively wedded to the depths. This is the place of her transformation. Forever after, she has her own name, Persephone. Borrowing from Esther Harding, I see Persephone as the embodiment of the eternal archetypal virgin, not in the sense of being chaste or untouched, but in the sense of being whole and complete. Furthermore, Persephone becomes the beloved wife of Hades and the queen of the underworld. Persephone's status and rights change so enormously that her power is matched by few other female divinities in the cosmos. Once again, this is not the part of the story Jungians typically notice. We rarely reflect upon the close connection between vulnerability, transformation, stature, influence, and authority. Yet all of these themes are clearly evident as the nameless daughter becomes an individual, powerful queen. We see something else in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which may also apply to people living with serious illness or injury, and the doctors, nurses, and counselors who tend them, as well as the family members. The journey is not simply about individual transformation. The maiden, like someone with serious illness, may undergo a terrifying period of abject loneliness. She may feel more isolated and individual, and paradoxically, more annihilated as an individual than at any time in her life. but it is a great mistake to think that the transformation is an individual event. One of the things we have lost in a culture that prizes individualism is the sensible and communal nature of our transformation. We don't just do this for ourselves. The transformation may not be complete until we recognize and perhaps cultivate its impact on others. An archetypal descent, like the maidens into despair, disorientation, and suffering, shares many similarities with traditional rites of initiation. Such rites, which take place across the world among diverse peoples, clearly tells us that the return carries with it an inescapable obligation. We are obliged to take on new roles and give something back to the community we return to in a deliberate and conscious fashion. Unless this happens, the transformation simply isn't complete. But giving back to the community need not be anything grand or difficult. One way is simply talking about what you know that you didn't know before. You can bear witness to the wisdom and depth the transformative illness or injury grants to everyday life. Another way is to be a compassionate witness for others who are living through transformative illness. In short, we need to create a communal sense of the value and purpose of such experiences for humanity as a whole, and not waste the lessons they offer. And to conclude, I'm reminded right now of a beautiful piece of dissertation research that one of my students recently completed. She's now Dr. Robin Beresford, and you can find her website and more about her at robinberesford.com. I'll put that in the chat as well, so we'll be able to see that. She used narrative inquiry to study many the stories of people who had to take, if you will, a medicine that could kill them in order to have the possibility of cure. So I want to mention Dr. Beresford's research. There are a few other people here on the call who are also interested in this, and I hope we hear from them as well. Now I'll turn it over to you, Shaler.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you. It's lovely to be here and to see everybody. Each time I hear you talk about this, I learn something new or something different sticks with me. And today, it's thinking of illness as an opportunity for transforming experience into story. I love that. I love that. And it can take a long time. I'm going to talk about something that happened 10 years ago today. And I've only recently been able to begin articulating it. But I'd like to begin with something right now that you guys as Jungians might appreciate. I turned 65 this month, and Elizabeth gifted me with a natal chart reading with Lawrence Hillman. And we met 4 days ago, and one of his observations is relevant for today. He said, "You have Pluto and Venus in your first house, and when there's a Pluto-Venus conjunction, there's a connection to Persephone's story. You might want to dig deeper into this myth and see how it might relate to your life." So, well, and he didn't know about this. I'm not pretending to understand the full scope of that connection, but in the interest of creating that communal sense of connection and purpose that you talked about, Elizabeth, today I'm going to share with you the first chapter in my Underworld experience. But before that, the last time Elizabeth and I spoke to a group about the underworld of illness, I only told my personal story and I identified completely with Persephone. But since then, I've just spent the last 4 months as a primary caregiver for my husband after he experienced a life-altering injury. So now I have some personal understanding of Demeter's love and determination as well. And there isn't time to share, the whole caregiving story today, but I would like to address one of Elizabeth's questions for caregivers. When did you realize your loved one's transformation might permanently alter your own life, too? Well, my answer, it was after my husband got through the crisis, the surgery, and the critical care. It was when he was facing the daunting task of having to learn to walk again. Can you all see the I just want to make sure I shared screen properly. We're good. When it came time for my husband to take his first steps, it became clear I could no longer rely on schedules and organization and efficiency to help him. Instead, I had to put myself in his shoes, so to speak, and feel his struggle. I needed to learn how best to love him in this state of extreme vulnerability. And to my surprise, I discovered I was able to respond to his fear and frustration with little bits of wisdom, like coping tips and methods of distraction, and perhaps most essentially, with humor I had gained through my own experience as a patient. It wasn't until I became a caregiver that I learned to fully appreciate the lessons I had learned as a patient. I never imagined the day would come when I'd identify as someone with expert experience in illness. But the truth is, as I look back on my life, illness has been like a squatter claiming residence in my body. And caring for my husband has given me confidence in my ability to articulate my experience with this squatter in ways that might be helpful to others. So, yes, Elizabeth, I am changed. I'm more than a patient now. I'm also an ally. I picture my illness as a temperamental chameleon, often changing appearance, but without any subtlety or objective to blend in. And just when I think I've dealt with it, it returns with a new expression of symptoms. And then I find myself wondering, am I facing another threshold? Or is this the same threshold I haven't quite crossed? In archetypal terms, you might call my illness a trickster. For most of us, it's not possible to fully understand the threshold experience while we're in the thick of it. We need time to develop perspective before we can see how it's changed us. And for this reason, I am going to tell you the story of my first experience of illness as a threshold, even though there's been some new expressions of it more recently. So let me turn back the clock. Do you remember where you were when the stroke of midnight marked the new millennium? Perhaps some of you, like me, were looking forward to a new chapter in your life. I got married at 12:01 on January 1st, 2000. And for the next few weeks, while my mind was swirling with the headiness of love and romance, I was blissfully unaware of what lay ahead. I was like Persephone in my naivete. Before Hades plucked her from life above and abducted her into the underworld, she'd been a carefree, unsuspecting maiden gathering flowers in a meadow. Then, in a moment, all of that was left behind. Persephone found herself in a new land with new rules, and she was unprepared. My unexpected, life-changing moment was not so much an abduction, but it was a knockout from a medical 1-2 punch. 5 weeks after my wedding, I went to the doctor for a pregnancy test, hoping it would be positive. But instead, I was told I had developed a pituitary adenoma. A few months after that, I went for a mammogram and received a diagnosis of breast cancer. So something was growing in my brain and something was growing in my breast, and neither was supposed to be there. I was thrust into the underworld of illness, and the terrain was unrecognizable. Soon, it became clear that I was battling very complicated and frightening invaders. Both conditions required ongoing invasive treatment, and I was prescribed a combination of benzodiazepines to help with anxiety and sleep. Within a month, I found myself transformed into a sedated, stumbling shell of a woman. But I accepted it and carried on. It took years of stumbling like a trooper before I realized that part of the reason I felt so disoriented was because I was masking my feelings with medication. How could I know where I stood if I didn't even know I was standing? The medication had blocked my anxiety, true, but it also blocked my awareness and orientation. I was left without a personal compass and lost my sense of direction, emotionally ungrounded and intellectually adrift. I lived this way for more than a decade. After a dozen years of treatment, I was extremely lucky. They shrunk the tumor in my brain, they removed the cancer from my breast. Two major wins. But during that time, my tolerance for benzos had increased and my dose had quadrupled. I was taking pills 5 times a day, and emotionally, I had flatlined. So instead of feeling joy at my medical successes, I felt nothing. Looking back now, I can see how benzos had numbed me. It's true, my benzo cocoon protected me from fear, but it also isolated me from feeling anything else. I was living in a state of perpetual disconnect. This was the knowledge I had to accept. Before I could fully participate in the new life awaiting me, I had to accept the truth about my cocoon. And like Persephone, choosing to eat the pomegranate seeds in order to learn more about her underworld, I chose to accept the truth of my reality and do something about it. I chose to discontinue my medication, and it was a hell of a task. It may surprise you to hear that breaking my addiction to benzodiazepines was the hardest battle of my life. It isn't this hard for everyone, but for thousands of us, it is almost insurmountable. Hopefully, there'll be fewer of us now. Benzo advocates had a major victory 3 years ago when the FDA finally mandated that all benzodiazepine prescriptions carry a black box warning. I created this image to give you an idea of how I felt. It would take a year of constant suffering and another year of limited functioning before I would free myself from the hell of slowly, painstakingly tapering my dose down to 0. Even though I'm a writer, I've known many times when an image says more than my words ever could. Perhaps that's common among those of us who have experienced life-altering illness. I think it might be. And thankfully, some of us are also gifted artists, able to express what the rest cannot. Carl Jung's patient, Christiana Morgan, is one of my favorite patient/artists. As you probably know, her visions of archetypal descent and return and transformative suffering are drawn from her personal experience. She might have been a good underworld ally for me, but I didn't learn of her work until many years after my own experience of descent. Yet her images speak to my soul as if she had been there, standing by my side the whole time. In this image, female Abraxas, I especially relate to her sense of burning from the inside out. In the months before I began my taper, I was at a loss for words. I'd tried to give up benzos one time before and failed. This time, I knew it was going to be a long haul, and I knew it was going to hurt like hell. Still, I remained speechless. Then I came upon this image. This image expressed how I was feeling. It even expressed what I was afraid to feel. This illustration shows a woman walking through Hades. When I first saw her, I felt conflicting emotions. I was equally attracted and repelled, but I found myself returning to gaze at her again and again. And within a very short time, I felt an urge to carry a reminder of her with me always. I needed her to bolster my courage, give me a sense of direction, and serve as the personal compass I had lost. I needed her as my personal ally. So I reimagined that woman's journey as my own and expressed it in the form of symbolic tattoos. The idea of creating underworld allies through tattoos was shocking to me because, well, I'm a suburban mom and had absolutely no history with body art, but I couldn't shake the idea. I was fearful of what lay ahead and felt intuitively that being able to gaze at a tattoo story would give me strength. And here's the part you might find interesting. At that time, I had never heard of Persephone, yet elements of her story are reflected in the images I chose to illustrate my path of slowly climbing out of benzo hell. So you see, I'd begun to sense that my health challenges were part of a bigger pattern long before I could name that pattern. Long before I knew of the mythical pattern of descent and return, I was envisioning aspects of archetypal transformation. Here we have flames and a phoenix. Looking back now, I believe I had an innate sense of being on an important path, but no idea that path had been illuminated in archetypal stories dating back thousands of years. My experience, like Persephone's, tested me and was transformative. In the end, I was changed, as was she, and I held a deeper respect for the challenges so many of us will face. I call my final tattoo the Immortal Goddess, and she represents the ideals of both artistic freedom and freedom from pain. My 4 tattoos served me well as underworld allies, and now, through them, my mythical experience will live on with me forever, as a reminder of both the personal and the eternal. Without knowing it, I had translated my story of archetypal descent and return into an example of the mythical in everyday life. My tattoo artist is also a painter, and a few years ago, I asked her to capture how I might feel if I could feel like my immortal goddess. We call this painting After the Storm, and I return to it when I need a reminder that my body is also my ally, even when it hurts. Like the blended colors of ink that created my tattoos, my body is a blend of my experiences. It's an expression of the dark, the light, and everything in between. Pain is a threshold, and there is indeed something beyond it. And as Elizabeth has reminded us, part of that something beyond is sharing our stories in gatherings like this one, with people like you, who might know what it's like to be shocked into wordlessness, or face a fear so big you're tempted to wrap yourself in a cocoon. People like you who can understand that when it comes to facing pain and suffering, there may never be a way out, but there will always be a way through. As a final gift to you, I'd like to share the work of an artist who's very special to me. Her paintings are archetypal in nature, and I wonder if she's aware of that. I don't know. Rebecca Suzanne Haynes is her name, and she lives in a forest in New Mexico, and she paints the animal companions she sees on her daily walks. Listen to the way her titles tell the story of crossing a threshold, and see if any of her animal friends feel like they're meant to be your allies as well. She named this one Courage, Dear Heart. And this is the magic doorway. Notice this time her brave traveler has an ally. And finally, know who you are. Taking a step toward knowing who we are is perhaps the primary gift of a threshold experience. But for me, long before I'll reach that place of knowing, if indeed it's a place that can be reached, I'd like to acknowledge some primary gifts I've received along the way. The first, we don't have to suffer alone. The second, once we've known suffering and loss, we've also gained valuable wisdom. And the third was an invitation to transform once again. For me, this was an invitation to transform into an ally. And although I haven't lived it yet, I can visualize a fourth gift. I can see a future where my threshold experiences will have given me everything I need to step into the honorable identity of elder. And for me, that makes it all worth it. If these gifts sound valuable to you too, then perhaps you might also agree when I suggest, with gratitude, that the call of a threshold experience is just as alive today as it was in ancient Greece. And so is our invitation to cross it. Thank you for listening.